Hey everyone, so we recently went to Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, which is now open at Disneyland, and we had the awesome build a lightsaber experience. And now we're actually going to show you how to build a workbench to hold your lightsaber for display, which is a really cool thing to be able to display, and it also has a spot for a kyber crystal. So the things you're going to need for this build are going to be some paintbrushes, some paint. We're using acrylic paint. I've got two different versions. I've got just a matte color and then also a metallic paint. So the black is the only one that I have that's matte. The other three are metallic. We're going to need some stainless steel nylon insert lock nuts. Those are size 1024. We're going to need a hot glue gun, some nice Loctite super glue in the gel form, and then a pencil, of course. I use an Allen wrench, can be any size. We're going to just use that to mark things up. A full-size metal file, some primer spray paint, two different grades of pretty fine sanding paper. These are like 1000, right around there. Fine enough to where you can actually sand things with it, but not super fine. And then a box cutter and also a metal ruler will come in handy. And then we're going to be making this build out of a piece of PVC palette. So that's basically PVC extruded foam. It's 1/4 inch. And for this project, you probably won't need a piece that's bigger than about 2 feet by 3 or 4 inches. That should be plenty of product. So I'd say go with 4 inches by 2 feet if you want the exact measurements, and that's going to be more than enough for this project. So we're going to start off by just eyeballing it. I designed this entire project just by looking at reference images of the workbench and then using a lightsaber to actually measure the piece out. So you can see we here have our sketch for all the parts. I did one sketch that was layered over itself for the overhead view, and then one sketch with the pieces actually lined up next to each other so they're all individual and ready to be cut out. Mark it out and then start cutting. I use a ruler to line up my lines. Just do one lighter press with the box cutter and then do multiple harder passes. If you score it enough, it'll be really easy to cut. That's the one thing that's great about the palette. It's not really very hard to cut at all. So you go ahead and go through and get that all cut out. So once you have the pieces all cut out, you can go ahead and pop them out. If you've scored good enough, you can pretty much just tear them away from the rest of the palette without damaging your main pieces that you're going to use for this project. There might be a few places where you have to score a little bit more or cut through. Now we've got all of our individual pieces. So there are only 5 pieces to this whole entire project. You got your main base, you have your 2 uprights, and then we have the platform, and then the actual kyber crystal platform that goes on top of that platform. So now we'll go ahead and get started with scoring the kyber crystal platform. So this piece we want to make look really rough because in the reference images it looks pretty battered, like it's had a lot of wear and tear from so many different kyber crystals that have been placed on top of it. So we're going to just take the box cutter and really go to town on that thing, trimming it down as much as we can, making it look really random and rough. So it's okay if you make a mistake, just go ahead and cut a little bit more from the other direction. It helps to have a sharp knife for this because that makes it all a lot easier. And once you have kind of the desired shape, then we can go ahead and check it out by measuring it up to it. If it looks like it's a good fit, we're putting it right on top of the other platform and just making sure that it looks good. Should fit just inside that outer box that we drew on that platform. If you need to take a little more off or sand it down, you can go ahead and take a little more off and sand it down. And I'm going to use the file now to actually kind of score the edges. So this is going to give kind of a little bit more of a worn look to it with some deeper cuts. So I wouldn't really recommend actually filing with this. You want to just kind of press into the piece of material, because if you file, you'll start seeing the marks from the file. You want to make it more like clean lines. So you can see there that we have the clean lines from that file created. They go kind of all the way across it, which is just fine. Now we're going to take our box cutter, and we actually want to make the top portion indented to where the kyber crystal would sit. So we're going to score that with the box cutter, just going back and forth, crisscross pattern. And then we'll take our piece of sandpaper and kind of grind away at it between that and the box cutter. You can kind of cut it at an angle to get those pieces to come up. Once you have enough of it ground down, you can sand it a little bit more to make it smooth or slightly smoother. And then we're going to swap back over to either our file or our Allen wrench. use those two to actually compress that center and make it actually indented, because you can't really get the indentation with the box cutter. So this is going to help kind of sand down or file down that interior portion that we want to have sit a lot lower than the edges. And it doesn't really matter if you mess up on this, you can always go back and file it, sand it one way or another. So just kind of have fun with it and work on making it look as close to the actual reference images that you have. And I'm going to go ahead and link some reference images below. You can see this file I'm using is a really nice tool, because on one end it's broken, and it's actually pretty nice because it gives a nice, really cool kind of broken metal edge, and we can actually use that as a stamp. So you can push down as hard as you can and kind of wear down into that piece of palette, and it'll give it an indentation, but it'll also give it some texture. And that's the point of this. We're trying to give it texture because we don't want just like a smooth surface. We want it to have a rough, really rough, worn look to it, and we're going to get that by slowly taking it down with the file, with the sandpaper, and with the box cutter. So once you've got it to where you feel like it looks good, it's all set. You can see we've got a nice indentation there, and then it's also very worn. So we're going to go ahead and come in and check it with our kyber crystal, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the platform that the kyber crystal is going to sit on. See, it still fits inside there, so that looks like it's pretty good, and that's how it'll sit on the actual platform. Now the next thing we're going to do is trace around the kyber crystal platform so we get kind of the outline, and that should be within your original limit lines that you drew. The goal is to have this smaller platform that the kyber crystal actually touches to sit kind of like it's in an indentation in the second platform. So to do that, we have to cut out kind of a groove around the whole thing. Now you could cut a hole in this piece and then put two pieces of kyber crystal platform, the smaller one, on top of each other to raise it up, but I thought this was just kind of an easier way to go about it, because if you cut down, you're going to have some really flimsy pieces of palette, and palette's pretty sturdy, but it's just not really as strong as I would have liked it to be if we did that. So instead, we're just cutting a groove out around the outer edge. You can do this by cutting your straight lines first and then going in a little bit of an angle on the curved portion that you sketched. And you can see we've got that chiseled out between using the box cutter and kind of just pulling the pieces out, and it should fit nice to where you can see the edge down there. And then you want to just take a little bit of sandpaper, go around, smooth things out, make sure you don't have any rough kind of tags sticking out on the edge of the palette. So once we have that done, we actually want to focus on the cradle for the actual saber. So I'm using a piece of PVC pipe. It's just about 2 inches wide, just under 2 inches wide on the outer diameter of the pipe. And this gives the cradle the perfect dimensions for the lightsaber to sit kind of in it, but it still sits up off of it, which is exactly what it does in the actual Savi's Workshop kyber crystal and lightsaber cradle on the workbench. So we're going to take that piece of ABS and we're going to cut it in half. And I used a scoring system. I didn't actually use a saw for this. I just scored with the box cutter multiple times along a straight edge that's clamped to the actual piece of ABS, and it cuts pretty easily. And then once you have that, you want to go ahead and file it down, and we're actually going to make it look like it's weathered. So we're going to take our file again and just go back and forth on it. Be kind of rough to it because we'll always sand down the edges, so it's okay if it's kind of bringing up the piece of ABS. And then we'll take the sandpaper and go ahead and rough up the whole thing. That way the paint will stick a little bit better, even though we are going to prime it. And if you don't have a file, you could also use the Allen wrench to kind of score into it. The ABS is pretty soft, so you shouldn't have any problems with that. Once we have that done, we'll go ahead and look at our base for the cradle. And these pieces are actually going to be holding up the cradle off of the platform. So we're going to have to cut grooves into them, and we're going to do that just by lining up the edge of the PVC or the ABS pipe, and then we're going to trace around the ABS pipe to get our outline, which is going to fit perfectly around the pipe. And then as you can see, we now have our perfect outline for the cradle, and we'll go ahead and cut that. Now cutting, you want to go a little bit slower on this one just because it's a curve, and it's very important that it actually stays pretty perfect to the shape of the pipe. So go ahead and cut that out. I usually just kind of press in through the palette straight down and then do some slow traces, and you should be able to wiggle it off. It's a little rough if you cut it out that way, but you can always take a piece of sandpaper and smooth it out. Or what I do is I actually take the pipe. You can see that fits pretty close here. You can take a little bit of sandpaper, take the pipe, and then wrap the pipe in the sandpaper, and then just file down the whole thing together. That way you don't lose the shape of the pipe. You don't want to take too much off because then you won't have a snug fit around the pipe, but a little bit's good. And you can see it fits pretty perfectly around the shape of the pipe. So now we've got that done, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the entire base and we're going to give it the kind of worn look. So using that file again that's broken, you could use just a regular file and just kind of stick to the corners. But if you have something that's broken like this, even a piece of wood would probably work. And it gives it some nice kind of marred marks that are unique and not consistent across the whole entire thing. So it looks like it's really naturally worn and kind of weathered, like it's been around for a while and banged up, which is exactly what we want. So then you're going to take your platform, mark it off so you don't mar the portion that's just going to be glued to, and we'll go ahead and mark that area using the file again. And I'm just dancing across it back and forth, kind of rolling it, and then not using my full strength to push down, but just enough to make a little bit of an indentation. Now you can see that we have the platform marked, and we can show it with the two supports, and then with our cradle sitting right on top. And it's actually starting to look like the workbench from Savi's workshop. So now we're going to attach the base pieces to the cradle. And to do this, you want to kind of line them up in this exact middle with the cradle face down on a table. If you have a level, you can put a level across them and check that. We're using the Loctite super glue here, and this is going to be used to actually attach them to all the pieces. I use this gel super glue for all of this because I find that it binds really fast, and it is actually really strong once it does bind to the plastics. I use a decent amount with the gel just because it's going to allow you to get a little bit of motion before it officially attaches itself to the PVC and the ABS. And that way if you make a mistake, you can kind of wiggle it around to get in the right position. So we've got them in the right position, and just like that, pretty much they've already adhered and they're already stuck on there really well. So we've got that, you can see. And now what we need to do is kind of make the artificial welds on the piece. So I'm going to use the hot glue gun, and we're going to start at one corner and be generous, do a circle, and then lift and move at least the same distance away from that circle so the edge is just barely touching if you were to do a second circle, and then do a second circle and kind of just go around the whole edge this way. I've got this example here that I'm going to show you, and this you can kind of see what I'm doing because it's hard to see on the actual piece. Basically just doing one blob and then another. That way we don't have a straight line, but it actually looks a little more like a weld. And the hot glue will kind of join together anyway, so you don't want to put them too close together. You want to leave a little space in between. So we're going to do that around both sides of the base. And you want to do this before you glue the cradle onto the base because it's a lot easier to get into the tight spaces. And then you can go around and kind of play with the hot glue right before it cools off entirely and gets hard. And if there are any mistakes, feel free to just go back and pop off the hot glue and redo it. So now we're going to attach our base plate to the platform for the kyber crystal, just using a little bit of the super glue. Same thing with the actual kyber crystal platform. Make sure you have that the right direction lined up with your previous scoring for the groove. And now we're going to mark off our rack on the base plate and put some glue on that. And that should line up just with the edge of the kyber crystal platform. That's how you know it's going to be perfect. So you have just about no overhang on the crystal platform, and then on the other opposite side you do have some overhang. Then you'll take the hot glue and go through and do the welds again. Same way we did on the top. This time we're going to be kind of in a tight situation, but there is enough room to actually get a small glue gun around there. That's why I'm using a small glue gun, because it's a lot easier to get into tight spaces like this instead of using a bigger glue gun. Go ahead and peel off all the loose glue strands. You may want to take a little bit of sandpaper and file it down if you do have any rough spots. So once you're happy with how it looks, we pretty much have our final workbench platform rack here all good to go. We just need to go and paint it. So I'm going to go over the paints I'm using for this project again. So real quick here, I'm using acrylic paint. They are metallic paints, so they do have a little bit of sheen to them. The black is matte black, it's not a metallic black, but the green is a metallic green, and the green is going to be for the actual platform the kyber crystal sits on. I'm using just a regular primer base for it to prime the ABS and the palette. I find that makes for a better surface texture to paint on. And then we have a variety of paint brushes here and also a sponge. So we're going to take our primer base and we're going to give it 2 coats of this, and in between we're going to let the coats dry, and then after each coat we're going to give it a little bit of a sanding just to make sure that it's smooth. So go ahead and go light with the first coat. Make sure you're not having any paint run anywhere, and then once you're satisfied with that, you can let it dry. So here we have our pretty much first coat on, and we're going to go ahead and let that dry, and then we'll apply the second coat. So we've got our first coat here, it's nice and dry. You can see still missed a few places, so kind of underneath, but that's what the second coat's for. So we're going to go ahead and take some sandpaper. This is a finer grit sandpaper, and we're just going to go over the rough spots. If you did have any paint kind of layer, go ahead and sand that down, and we'll apply the second coat. So here we are applying the second coat, and this time I'm going to make sure that I get everything, even the bottom side of the saber rack and also the bottom side of the platform. So after we let that dry, here you can see we have our final version of the rack, and it looks all consistently primed. Got the rough spots all sanded down, and so now we can actually get into painting it to make it look more realistic. So we're going to take our brown, metallic brown, and we're going to mix that with a little bit of black just because we want it to be a darker brown. The actual workbench was pretty dark, and then the platform for the kyber crystal was a little bit lighter, kind of more of a goldish, and then the actual kyber crystal worn platform piece was kind of greenish. So we're going to try to replicate that. So these are our browns mixed together. The first layer you'll want to go ahead and apply a decent amount of paint to it. And it doesn't have to cover everything because this is the first layer, so you just want to go around, get everything covered with one coat of paint, and then we'll go ahead and add our second layer, which is going to add to that look. If we need to make the second layer a little darker, we can make it darker, but the key is to just get that primer all covered up across the whole piece. So we're going to go ahead and go through and cover it as best we can for the first run. Don't worry about the brush strokes because you'll still be able to see the brush strokes. Once it dries, it's not as obvious, but the more we add to the layers of paint, the better it'll look. So as time goes on, you just want to add to the layers, and you can't really mess up with this process because you can always go back and paint over it with a different color if you wanted to. So we've let it dry. This is what it looks like now. You can see it's a little bit of got a little bit of shine to it, which is just what we want because we want it to look like metal, but we also want it to look kind of worn. So we're going to make sure that we don't have it too bright. Go ahead and darken it up with the second layer. So this is our second layer of paint going on, and we did add a little more black to it, but you'll be able to kind of eyeball what that looks like. It's a pretty dark brown, but it'll still have that metallic shine to it just because of the type of paint. So after using the large brush first, we're switching to a smaller brush so we can kind of get into there in all the smaller nooks and crannies and get those covered with paint. So once we've done that, we're actually going to take our sponge, get it slightly damp, and we're going to mix some of our lighter bronze or goldish color with some black. And this is going to be the paint for the slightly lighter portion of the Kyber crystal platform. So we're going to dab the sponge into that, and it's already got the dark color underneath, so we're just going to dab the lighter color on top of that. And we'll see why we're doing this, because if you were to just paint over it, it would just look like one uniform color, but we want it to actually look kind of worn. So we're going to just dab that color across. That way it's kind of more natural, and it does look a little more textured and more like metal overall. So we've got it all painted. You can see it is a lighter brown to it, and that's just what we wanted. Then we're going to go through and kind of touch up the other areas with the smaller paintbrush. So we got to get the edges, so we're going to do the edges with the smaller paintbrush. Just take your time. Again, if you mess up, you can either wipe it off or you can blend it in with a darker color. So now we're going to take darker brown even and go through and just kind of add some more texturing to the main platform so it looks a little more broken up, not quite as uniform. It's difficult to see here, but it does actually show in person that there is a different color on there, and once it dries it'll look even better. So it's looking pretty good. We've definitely made it look more like metal than PVC palette, so that's a good sign. Now we're going to do the actual crystal platform with our green. I went with a much brighter green just because I didn't want to have to purchase white color to mix with it. So we're going to mix this brighter green with some black to just bring it down and make it look a little duller. You can also mix it with one of the browns to give it this kind of darker color. Just depends on how you want to do it. There is no right or wrong way to paint things. It's all about trial and error. So once we get the first coat on, we can decide if we need to add some different colors to it, if we need to bring up the color of the paint to make it a little brighter, or if we want to dull it down. So it looks pretty good. We're going to just take some black now and go around the edge of the platform in that crevice, and we want to make sure that that's pretty dark down there because it is supposed to look like it has some depth to it. So we're going to just go in with a tinier brush, kind of fill in all the little areas, make sure there's no primer gray. And we'll take our sponge and go back across the platform again to give it that texture, kind of break up the brush strokes so it doesn't look like we just covered it with paint. And this will also help with the texture if you use a little bit of a different color, so maybe use your kind of lighter brown or bronze. And you can see we have it pretty much completed. Alright, so there's our main Savi's Workbench lightsaber rack, and it looks pretty damn good. So you can see we've got it right here next to one of the other builds that I have. Before we finish, there is one more thing to do. We need to take the nuts and attach those to the platform, because in reality the platform's bolted to the entire workbench, so we want to make that look like it's there in this. So we'll go ahead and just put some super glue in the bottom of the nut. Now you could do this before you primed it. I chose to do it after I primed it on both these, just because that's how it worked for me in the process, but it's up to you if you want to put the bolts on first, or the nuts on first, and then prime the whole thing together. What you do need to do though is take the hot glue gun and fill in the center of each nut so that the paint won't actually just fall into a hole, because you want to look like it's actually attached to something. So that's why we're going to fill in that hole with some hot glue to make it look like there is a bolt that the nut's screwed onto. And now we're going to go ahead and paint the nuts. So same thing, mix up the brown with some black, make it sure it's pretty dark, pretty close to matching. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, and just brush over those, taking your time to make sure that you get all the silver covered. Okay, so we've got those all painted. As you can see here, they're covered up. Got our platform done, and it should be all ready to hold our lightsaber and put it on display. And there we have it, our finalized lightsaber rack from Savi's workshop. So I hope you guys liked seeing this build in action. If you want to see more awesome stuff like this, including more stuff from Galaxy's Edge, make sure you subscribe to this channel. And don't forget to comment below if you have any questions about this build. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.